By noon, the Germans had increased the pressure from the front, and their attacks were becoming more and more ferocious. The unit commanders reported to the brigade commander that they were holding on with their last strength, but Katukov sent his only precious reserve, 3 heavy KV tanks, to the city. With every passing hour, the situation for the brigade became more threatening. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a message was received that a new, fresh German tank division was moving along the highway just 30 kilometers from the city. The automobile bridge over the Zusha River is under heavy fire, and the ford east of the city has already been occupied by the Germans. The only way to escape is to use the railway bridge. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Deputy Political Commissar Zavaleshin brought the first good news of the day. Tanks would still pass over the railway bridge. Katukov contacted the Corps headquarters again and finally received the long-awaited order to retreat. At 8 o'clock in the evening, Katukov gathered all the staff of the headquarters and loudly ordered them, regardless of their ranks and high positions, to form a column of 2. Together with Commissioner Boyko, he personally led the column to the Devil's Bridge. The main problem there was that the sappers only managed to hastily lay the flooring. The boards withstood the weight of the equipment, but constantly moved apart. Horses with broken legs had to be shot, and soldiers and staff members carried heavy equipment on their hands. At 11 o'clock in the evening, the torrential rain suddenly stopped, and a full moon appeared, brightly illuminating the bridge. The Germans immediately opened targeted fire. Katukov sent Sergeant Kapitonov's tank there. "Knock out the shooters and set fire to all the wooden buildings to create a smokescreen," he ordered. The light and smoke from this fire reliably hid the bridge from the Germans. At 2 o'clock in the morning, the crossing of the last 2 tank battalions began. When the last tank of the brigade crossed, it was already light, and Katukov gave the order to blow up the bridge. The longest day, as Katukov called it in his sincere memoirs, October 10, 1941, is finally over. We are summing up this incredible confrontation. The results were stunning. It took von Longermann's 4th Panzer Division 8 agonizing days to cover only 60 kilometers. During this time, the German division lost up to an entire infantry regiment and 133 tanks in battle. The brigade's own losses amounted to 23 tanks and 555 men. Although the exact figures can be debated, Guderian's dramatic change of opinion about the T-34 is a historical fact. In November, he called an emergency meeting of German designers near Orel, which was attended by the legendary Ferdinand Porsche himself. Guderian personally brought him to the battlefield and offered to talk about Soviet tanks with tankers who had seen death in the face. They spoke briefly and clearly. "Make us exactly the same 34. You and I can see that German pride did not allow them to simply copy the car. They created a Panther that repeated many of the key decisions of the T-34. But all this did little to help Guderian himself, whom Hitler eventually considered personally responsible for the collapse of the offensive on Moscow. We conclude this story realizing how closely the destinies of people and machines were intertwined that October. On December 26th, Fast Heinz was dishonorably removed from combat duty. On the contrary, Mikhail Katukov's career took off rapidly. In Victoria's May of 1945, Marshal Katukov's tanks were the first to roar into Berlin. For the unprecedented battles near Mtsensk, the 4th Tank Brigade became the first tank unit of the Red Army to be awarded the honorary title of Guards. It was with her that the glorious formation of the Tank Guard began, which became a threat to the enemy until the very end of the war. I looked through the binoculars, and the shadows of the doomed were darting in the flames. But then the stupor passed, and there was intense excitement among the commanders. Captain Schumack was given a friendly pat on the back and a firm handshake, and he, pleased with the effect, just smiled modestly. Perhaps many people then thought that the new weapon would lead to the most radical changes in the course of the entire war. Later, Katyusha, or Stalin's organs, as the Germans called them, were often and extremely successfully used against tanks. It turned out that in order to destroy German tanks, a rocket explosion within a radius of 10 meters simply turned over light German tanks with an explosive wave. According to Katukov's report, the Germans lost 43 tanks, 16 anti-tank guns, 6 vehicles, and up to 500 soldiers and officers that day. Only 2 tanks burned down on the battlefield. 4 of the damaged vehicles were soon returned to service. Late in the evening on October 10th, Katukov's brigade retreated along the highway to Ilkovo-Golovlyo-Sheno line. Endless fighting, sleepless nights, mud, slush, and endless icy rain exhausted people to the limit. It snowed heavily in the afternoon, and the overcoats, which had nowhere to dry, immediately got soaked through. "How do you inspire the fighters in these harsh days?" Katukov asked his commissar. "I never lie to them," Boyko replied firmly. "There is nothing worse for a soldier's morale than when a sweet half-truth bursts at the seams. I try to explain it so that they understand that victory or defeat is not just the result of instructions from above. This is your personal victory or your personal defeat." Let's evaluate this wisdom of the commissar. In the darkest times, the honest truth has become more reliable than any propaganda. After the shock of the Katyusha volley, the Germans behaved very cautiously for 2 days. At this time, Katukov threw all his forces into creating a false front line, skillfully confusing the enemy. On the morning of the 8th, Lyubushkin arrived at Katukov's command post. He called for reinforcements, the brave frontier regiment under the command of Colonel Pyashev, and ordered them to continue defending Mtsensk at all costs. The border guards formed small sabotage groups, crept over the neutral zone unnoticed at night, and cut the sleeping German occupiers with strong daggers. It was then, in the harsh autumn of 1941, that the conviction began to steadily form among the soldiers and officers of the Wehrmacht that the war on the Eastern Front was fundamentally different from the war in the West. In the rear, in faraway Germany, they could not really explain exactly how everything was different. Only one thing was clear, that everything was much worse in Russia. On the morning of October 9th, 50 Junkers dive-bombers violently bombed empty trenches for 15 minutes to the heart-rending wail of sirens. The brigade's anti-aircraft gunners shot down 5 of them, and the 6th surprised everyone by hitting the trajectory of a projectile from a field gun and scattering burning fragments. After the bombing, tanks appeared. The observer shouted, "I see tanks, 20 tanks straight ahead, 16 on the right." The Germans launched their main attack on Sheno, trying to bypass the defense of our brigade from a vulnerable flank. In the Sheno area, a group of T-34 tanks and a company of BT-7 tanks fell into a skillfully placed ambush. Katukov immediately sent help. Tanks under the command of Lieutenant Vorobyov, Senior Lieutenant Bourda, and Senior Sergeant Frolov bypassed the German column from the flanks and calmly approached it at point-blank range. Their appearance was completely unexpected for the Germans, and the enemy, having lost 11 tanks, shamefully retreated. But at that moment, Katukov was handed a telephone receiver and alarmingly informed that the Germans had broken through on the Bolokov highway and the entire corps was in grave danger of encirclement. You and I understand how thin the line was between triumph and death. On the morning of October 10th, the Germans behaved strangely. Small groups of tanks and infantry sluggishly attacked the front line of defense. It soon became clear that they were just a distraction, and the main attack was on the left flank. Seeing the dense chains of approaching tanks, some of the cadets faltered and left their positions. At 11 o'clock in the morning, Katukov was informed that enemy tanks had already been spotted in the very center of Mtsensk. Major General Burkhard Müller-Hillebrand later believed that the appearance of the T-34 tanks radically changed the entire tactics of tank forces. Until now, certain requirements had been placed on the design of the tank and its armament, in particular to suppress infantry and infantry support equipment. But now, the main task was to destroy enemy tanks at as great a distance as possible. At the same time, new tank designs appeared, based on which Panther and Tiger tanks were later created, which became the answer to the Russian challenge. The sudden change in tactics of the tank forces cost the 4th Division dearly at Orel. Katukov's tankers operated in coordinated groups of 3 to 5 vehicles, concentrating fire on one target like wolves. German tanks caught fire one after another, and soon the Germans began to retreat without orders, overcome with fear. 18 burnt-out tanks of the 4th Division of the Wehrmacht remained in the positions of the Soviet battalion. After receiving alarming reports of strong Russian resistance on the Orel and Mtsensk highway, Guderian launched diversionary attacks on Bolokov and Novosil, and Katukov's brigade was forced to withdraw to the village of First Warrior. However, Katukov was forced to retreat not under pressure, but because of his well-chosen tactics of mobile defense. Repeating tank ambushes in the same place would be a fatal mistake. The new position near the village of First Warrior was truly ideal, with a magnificent view to the south from the heights, from where the Germans were advancing relentlessly, and numerous bushes and groves made it possible to reliably disguise the tanks. In the early morning of October 6th, the sentries excitedly reported that more than 100 enemy tanks and armored personnel carriers were moving from the direction of Orel. They violently attacked Captain Kochetkov's battalion, which was occupying positions on one of the key heights. German tanks were already combing their trenches when Katukov allowed his tanks to open fire and sent his trusty T-34 to help the exhausted infantry. Tanks appeared from behind the edges of the forest and struck the side of the advanced group of Germans. Before they could recover, the T-34 tanks disappeared into a small ravine and a few minutes later suddenly appeared on the left from behind a hillock and joined the battle again. Later, an amazing story was recorded about the crew members of one T-34 tank. An enemy shell hit the left side of Lyubushkin's tank and penetrated the armor. There was a deafening explosion inside the car. The tankers were blinded and heavily stunned, but they did not give up. Fedotov, half fainting, pressed the starter button. The engine started up, but no gear except reverse gear was engaged. Fedotov backed up, and the tank rolled away, shuddering. Meanwhile, the smoke and gas inside the car dispersed, and Lyubushkin again opened accurate fire on the fascist column. Soon, 3 more enemy vehicles caught fire one after another. For this battle, Tank Commander Senior Sergeant Ivan Lyubushkin was deservedly awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. After losing 15 tanks in a few minutes, the Wehrmacht's 4th Division retreated in disarray. You and I understand that it was precisely this kind of personal valor that broke the German offensive schedules. Towards nightfall, Katukov was informed that the Germans had again concentrated forces on the highway and were planning to repeat the attack. Night battles could become a serious problem for Soviet tankers. The decision fell out of the blue, and Captain Chumok, who personally arrived from General Lelyushenko, came to the brigade command post. "Commander of the Guards Mortar Division," he saluted clearly. "I've been ordered to increase fire on your area. 1 salvo." "Why only 1?" Katukov was genuinely surprised. "Don't worry, it will be more than enough." Neither Katukov nor his tankers had ever seen the famous Katyusha in action before. In his memoirs, he described the indelible impression of the first salvo. "When we got out of the crevice a few minutes later, we saw flames dancing in the ravine below. With each passing second, the flames grew wider and spread, and soon an unimaginable sea of fire was raging in front of us. Stunned by the unprecedented sight, we stood there, unable to utter a single word." Berta let the column get closer, within dagger range, and opened devastating fire. Several German armored personnel carriers and light tanks immediately caught fire, turning the road into a graveyard of vehicles. Wheels and pieces of torn tracks flew into the air. 2 T-34 tanks jumped out onto the road and, firing incessantly from machine guns, began to crush trucks with terrified infantry. The Germans fled, abandoning all their expensive equipment. Deputy Political Instructor Bagursky, showing extreme bravery, standing tall on Lieutenant Kukarkin's tank, fired at the fleeing fascists first with a rifle and then with a pistol, personifying the rage of the entire people. On the 5th of October, in the early morning, a tedious fine rain began to fall, turning the soil into a trap. The country roads turned into a continuous muddy mess. Reconnaissance groups on motorcycles were hopelessly stuck, and the Germans had to send mounted patrols ahead of them, as if going back to centuries past. The commander of the 4th Panzer Division, von Lungermann, hated this Russian weather with all his soul, which, together with the soldiers, stood up for the motherland. There is too much dirt in Russia in the fall, absorbing the power of the engines. And intelligence in Russia is always wrong. They confidently said that Stalin had no one, but in the evening, the Eagle was suddenly attacked by brand new Russian T-34 tanks. The damned mud made it impossible to maneuver. All he could do was move slowly along the highway to Mtsensk, knowing that somewhere ahead he would inevitably encounter Russian defenses. But von Lungermann was hardly seriously worried about this. The spirit of easy victories was still alive in his heart. On the border near Dubno, he participated in a huge battle when 500 German tanks destroyed 3,000 Soviet tanks, many of which were the latest but inexperienced. Then Stalin lost his best professional tankers. It is clear that his Ural factories in the deep rear continue to produce new tanks, but who is sitting in them now, the general wondered. German intelligence soon discovered a Russian infantry battalion entrenched on the banks of a small river. Combat reconnaissance revealed the entire defense system, and now the battalion's positions were fiercely shelled by several German bomber planes that tore through the ground. When the bombardment ended, von Lungermann launched a decisive attack with 40 light tanks with powerful infantry support. He watched through binoculars as the tanks, slowly and carefully rolling over the hummocks, moved along the lowlands towards the Russian positions, and suddenly remembered that the Eagle was attacked by Soviet tanks, and in front of him there were only Soviet infantry. Where are the Russian tanks? Von Lungermann thought tensely. On the other side of the front, Katukov also put down his binoculars and thought about his progress. The Germans combed the trenches of Captain Kachukov's battalion, shooting his soldiers with machine guns. Our camouflage T-34 tanks stood in ambush at the edge of the forest, holding their breath. You and I can see that this confrontation was not just a battle of technology, but a clash between two military schools. The brigade commander ordered his tanks to engage, and as soon as they appeared over the hill, the German attack stopped, as if it had hit an invisible but insurmountable wall. After the war, Lieutenant General Erich Schneider recalled that, despite some design flaws, German tanks fully justified themselves in the early years of the war. Even small tanks of the first and second types, whose participation in a major war was not envisaged, showed themselves in battles no worse than others, until in early October 1941, Russian T-34 tanks appeared east of Orel in front of the German 4th Panzer Division and demonstrated to our tank crews, accustomed to victories, their full potential. Superior weapons, armor, and maneuverability. The T-34 tank created a real sensation. Russian tank of 26 tons was armed with a 76mm cannon, the shells of which penetrated the armor of German tanks from a huge distance of 1.5 to 2 kilometers, while German tanks could hit Russian tanks from a distance of no more than 500 meters. It was a technological knockout, and you and I can imagine the shock the German crews were experiencing.
The brigade was given the almost impossible task of moving in the direction of Orel and defending the city at all costs, but according to the frantic words of the retreating scattered troops, Orel was already completely occupied by the Germans and saturated with enemy spirit. Commander Mikhail Katukov, a man of iron will, had only 46 tanks at his disposal, including a battalion of the legendary but already aging BT-7 light tanks. But the brigade arrived by rail gradually. The trains were unloaded under constant fire and the threat of air raids, so the brigade commander sent the first few unloaded tanks for immediate reconnaissance. 13 T-34 tanks with an amphibious group of courageous cadets of the Tula Military School on board were sent for reconnaissance under the command of an experienced battalion commander Gusev. When the group reached the village of Ivanovskoye, Gusev sent forward a patrol platoon of 3 T-34 tanks. Approaching the outskirts of the city, the tanks came under crushing heavy fire. Heavy machine guns of the Germans tore the soldiers on the armor to shreds and managed to set fire to the spare fuel tanks on all 3 vehicles. The commander led the platoon out from under dagger fire. The tankers, showing miracles of composure, abandoned their burning fuel tanks, and the T-34, expertly bypassing the center of resistance, drove into the maze of unfamiliar streets of occupied Orel. Soon, the connection with them was completely and tragically lost. Gusev, trying to save the situation, sent 3 more T-34 and then 2 more heavy steel giants KV to help. All the tanks disappeared without a trace into the ruins of the city as soon as they disappeared behind the first houses. All communication with them was completely and irrevocably cut off. Today, you and I can judge the fate of these heroes from photographs taken by German soldiers passing through Orel, where wrecked cars can be seen in city squares as mute witnesses to the desperate struggle. After an unsuccessful reconnaissance, Gusev was forced to remain inactive until the onset of darkness. The night was cold, piercing, and rainy, and the ominous, bloody glow of fires hung over the Eagle. Suddenly, a column of 10 tanks appeared on the highway leading to Bolkov. At first, they were mistaken for their own returning units, but when the moon came out from behind dark clouds for a moment, the tankers saw that they were German tanks. Gusev ordered T-34 to open fire at point-blank range. 2 German tanks caught fire immediately, turning into torches. 2 more caught fire after several minutes of fierce firefight in complete darkness. The remaining Germans, firing at random and panicking, hastily retreated. You and I understand that this night battle was the first wake-up call for German strategists accustomed to easy victories. In the morning, Katukov arrived in Ivanovskoye with the main forces of the brigade, preparing for decisive battles. Although the remnants of 4 German triads were black in front of Gusev's positions, he received a harsh scolding from the brigade commander for his losses and the unacceptable loss of communication with the reconnaissance squad. Soon, Senior Lieutenant Berda's group returned from reconnaissance, and his actions were much more thoughtful and successful. Having camouflaged his tanks on the southeastern outskirts of Orel, Berda conducted a reconnaissance on foot and discovered a German anti-tank artillery battalion cunningly hidden in barns and haystacks. He did not get into trouble and remained in ambush on the Orel and Mtsensk highway. In the morning, a large column of Germans, armored personnel carriers with anti-tank guns mounted on them, about 24 light tanks, and 3 powerful T-4 tanks, as well as several trucks with infantry confident in their safety, left Orel. In October 1941, 50 Soviet tanks delivered an extremely unpleasant and crushing surprise to 300 Wehrmacht tanks, forever changing the perception of the world's military elite about the capabilities of armored vehicles. The plan of Colonel General Heinz Guderian, nicknamed the High-Speed Heinz for his lightning strikes, consisted of a decisive and merciless offensive from the Glukovo settlement area to Orel, then a crushing march to Serpukhov, and from Serpukhov in a direct march to Moscow in order to tie a knot around the neck of the Soviet capital. The actions of the 2nd Tank Group were an integral and key part of the general offensive of Army Group Center, but the cunning, prudent, and overly ambitious Guderian chose to act 2 days before the official start of the large-scale Operation Typhoon, wanting to gain the laurels of the winner before others. He advanced before the rest of the front, that is, on September 30th, and for the first 2 days, his group was covered by the full power of Army Group Center aviation, creating absolute and overwhelming air superiority, turning the roads into a fiery inferno. But the Germans did not expect to encounter any organized and angry resistance on this sector of the front, considering the Russians to be completely broken. There was a euphoric mood in the Berlin headquarters. It was believed that the main and combat-ready remnants of the Red Army had finally surrendered in the encirclement near Kiev, and now Stalin simply had no soldiers or tanks left to defend his capital. In fact, at that critical moment in history, the situation looked exactly like this, and the road to Moscow seemed to the enemy not just open, but lined with victorious marches. You and I understand that it is precisely at such moments, when the death of the state seems inevitable, that the true character of the people and the greatness of its defenders manifest themselves. Let's think together about what extraordinary courage it took to stand in the way of this avalanche of steel. On September 30th, Guderian's tanks broke through the hastily erected defenses of young and brave cadets of the Kharkov Military School, who heroically tried to delay the avalanche of steel with their bodies. On October 1st, General von Langermann's 4th Panzer Division occupied Sevsk without encountering serious obstacles. On October 3rd, the tanks of the 4th German Division marched victoriously into Orel. Guderian wrote with undisguised pride in his diary that the capture of the city was so swift and unexpected for the townspeople that peaceful life was still in full swing, trams continued to run calmly along the routes, and the city dweller did not even immediately realize that other people's tanks with black crosses were driving through the streets. In the same days, Guderian, reveling in his victory, wrote down the following extremely arrogant and erroneous arguments. The Soviet T-34 tank is a typical example of backward Bolshevik technology. This tank cannot be compared in any way with the best versions of our tanks, which we produced with all German care and which repeatedly proved their complete technological superiority on the battlefields throughout Europe. On October 3rd, the Soviet 4th Tank Brigade, full of determination, arrived in Mtsensk, located between Serpukhov and Orel.